And we saw that about 2/3 of patients had pain relief with either the THC-CBD mix or the THC alone. And those were both statistically significant and superior to the placebo cannabis. The CBD, meanwhile, was not superior to the placebo cannabis for pain relief at 2 hours.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
I'm pleased to welcome today Dr. Nathaniel Schuster, who is a professor and medical director of the UC San Diego Center for Pain Management. Dr. Schuster conducted the first placebo-controlled trial of cannabinoids for acute migraine, and his ongoing research includes clinical trials studying treatments for migraine and neuropathic pain, and he's also a colleague of mine. Welcome, Dr. Schuster.
Wonderful to join you today, Dr. Grant.
So, before we start, would you mind saying a few words about your own background, how you became interested in possible therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids for migraine?
Yeah, so I come from the perspective of somebody who treats lots of people with migraine, and an interest in clinical trials and an interest in doing non-industry funded clinical trials just for the purposes of informing patients and informing doctors. One of the most fun parts of doing this study is that it wasn't looking at bringing anything to market. It was just to inform doctors in their discussions with patients. So I did a neurology residency followed by a headache fellowship for 1 year and then a pain fellowship for 1 year. And my clinical practice is treating people with headache conditions, pain conditions, and a lot of patients who have both. And so the most common clinical condition that people see doctors for in the headache space by far is going to be migraine. Migraine is also a very common reason why people end up going to the emergency room, reason why people, talk to other healthcare professionals. We have a lot of really good headache treatments, but none of them are helpful for everybody. And so we have treatments that I prescribe all the time, triptans and CGRPs, that people can use to treat migraine attacks. And there's other medicines that people can use to treat migraine attacks, but they don't work for everybody. And so for treating an acute migraine attack, you want something that's going to work fast. And vaporized cannabis is something that we know a lot of people out there have been using, but it had never been studied in a randomized controlled trial. There really wasn't much clinical evidence for it at all. So it was really a great privilege to be able to do this study.
Right. And just before, since our audience is varied, you mentioned some current classes of drugs, triptans. Could you give examples of those?
Well, the most commonly prescribed examples of the triptans are sumatriptan, brand name Imitrex, rizatriptan, brand name Maxalt, and the most common of the calcitonin gene-related peptide or CGRP medicines are rimegepant, brand name Nurtec, brojapant, brand name Ubrelvy. And we were really excited when we had these new, for example, with rimegepant and brojapant coming to market. But the pain relief, pain freedom rates, most bothersome symptom freedom rates at 2 hours, when you look at the published studies, that they were probably more modest than people were expecting. I have a lot of patients who benefit from them, but certainly what we know from the research is that they're not effective for everybody. So there's still, even with new medicines, unmet need.
Okay. So we kind of got into the medicines, but let's start off by, can you just define migraine for us?
Yeah. So migraine is a headache that's associated with other neurologic symptoms. Most commonly, those will be light sensitivity or photophobia, sound sensitivity or phonophobia, and nausea. And they can have other associated neurologic symptoms as well with them. Very often they make people have to stop doing what they're doing, lie down in a dark room, go to sleep. Typically untreated, they last 4 hours or longer. And they were, according to the World Health Organization, the leading cause of years lived with disability amongst people in their 30s through disease. So very common cause of disability worldwide. 40 million Americans, 1 billion people around the world any given year will experience a migraine.
And again, are there any known causes? Is this genetic?
Yeah, so there's certainly a familial component to it where it runs in families. One of the reasons I believe that a lot of people might not talk to a doctor is, well, if your parents, your siblings, your children get migraines, that you might think that everybody gets migraines as just something that people live with. But in fact, it's a medical condition that we have a lot of good treatments for. And so for people who are affected by migraine, I certainly encourage you to discuss with your doctor and discuss the many good medications out there before potentially going to, a dispensary and self-medicating. That we have a lot of good prescription medicines out there that are worth discussing with your doctor.
Okay. Um, Maybe take us back to your early work here. Why did you think cannabis might be a treatment for migraines? We know you're a clinician, or your migraine patients asking you about cannabis.
Yeah, so here in San Diego, I think a lot of people before they ever come to me that they are trying cannabinoids to treat acute migraine, and so some people they tell me that they get benefit, and some people they tell me that they don't get benefit. But certainly, it's widely used amongst our patients. And there was a really nice study done by my collaborator Michelle Sexton, where she surveyed about 1,500 people through Washington state medical cannabis dispensaries. And 35.5% of them reported that they were using cannabis to treat headache or migraine. So we know that out there in the community, it's one of the most common reasons why people use cannabinoids for medical purposes. And when this survey asked them, what's your preferred route of administration? That people were preferring, 81% of them said that their preferred route was inhaled or vaporized, smoked. And that goes with what is intuitive about the acute treatment of migraine, which is that you want something that's going to get to the brain quickly to break that migraine before it progresses enough that it becomes more treatment refractory. And then there was also some other studies, surveys, other surveys of patients, prospective studies, not high levels of evidence that point to that cannabinoids might be effective for the acute treatment of migraine. And so all of that came together to say, hey, we have a really compelling reason to do a study like this.
All right. Well, why don't you tell us about the study? Kind of what were your hypotheses, endpoints that you were interested in, how you chose the products that you chose?
So in this study, we wanted to test whether cannabis is going to have migraine pain freedom, pain relief, most bothersome symptom freedom at 2 hours, and whether that's going to be sustained out through 24 and 48 hours, even after the cannabis had worn off and was no longer having an effect on the patients, if the migraines were likely to still be gone. Mm. And so we chose the percentages that we studied for practical purposes, what the NIDA drug supply program had available, but also based on prior neuropathic pain data, and sort of took it up a little bit higher, from 4% up to 6%. And our anecdotal experience of having patients saying that with a 2-to-1 ratio, more CBD than THC, was relatively well tolerated, relatively beneficial. And so what we had then was 6% THC, 11% CBD for this study. And
So,
so, yes,
if I could just interrupt and clarify, you had mentioned the NIDA drug supply program. Can you say a word about why you got it from NIDA, not a dispensary?
yeah. So for doing science, that's the gold standard right now. This is from the federal government, from the NIDA drug supply program, cannabis flower that's available to scientists to do science without the involvement of any companies. This is what researchers do when they're just trying to test scientific hypotheses in the most unbiased manner possible. But they make available also a placebo cannabis, which is really important to be able to do, to be able to use if you're doing research from which the THC and CBD had been extracted. And so for doing science, this was the best way to go about doing things.
Yeah. Yeah, and plus, of course, cannabis was and remains a Schedule One drug, and there was no other source that was suitable for a clinical trial, right? That was certified product that was considered vetted in terms of how it was produced and safety and such for clinical experiments. So it was really the only place to go at the time, I think.
Yes.
There are some other manufacturers now, but really neither remains the main source. Anyway, that's a side issue, but doing this kind of work has some trying elements, shall we say, and a lot of hoops to jump through, right?
Yes. Lots of hoops, but certainly well worth it.
Right. Okay, so tell us a little more about the design of the study then.
The design of the study was in many ways very similar to the way that the triptans and more recently the CGRPs were studied for acute migraine, where you have somebody take a medication either as early as possible in a migraine attack, at the mild stage or at the moderate or severe stage. We decided to wait till the moderate or severe stage for this study. But that it had to be within the first 4 hours of a migraine attack, so that you were comparing apples to apples in this study, and that you were treating migraine when it was most likely to be responsive earlier on in the attack. And then you record using a digital app. So you're having patients treating out there in the real world when they're experiencing a migraine, and then you can collect data. We collected data at 1 hour, 2 hours, 24 hours, and 48 hours. And that's the way that if a drug company is designing a study, that's the way that they would do it. Drug companies don't usually use in this space crossover studies. We did because it allowed us to get a lot more data from us relative, from without needing to recruit as many patients. So we had each patient able to treat up to 4 migraine attacks. So we'd recruited 92 patients. We ended up getting data from 247 migraine attacks. Had we had each patient only treat 1 migraine attack and we're giving them all a pretty expensive research grade vaporizer to use, that it would have really made the study probably just a smaller study with less data, or also would have made it a lot more expensive and taking a lot longer, harder to do. So we used a crossover design, and patients were able to treat up to 4 migraine attacks, each with um, cannabis flower containing 6% THC alone, or cannabis flower containing CBD 11% alone, or cannabis flower containing both THC 6% and CBD 11%, or the placebo cannabis that we discussed earlier. And they did this in a randomized double blind order, so they didn't know which one was which when they were administering it. And they all were instructed to use 4 puffs using this research process called the Fulton Uniform Puff Procedure to again be comparing apples to apples. So across all the migraines, people were using similar comparable dosages of administration, at least, even if there will still be some variability between people based on how deeply they inhale, their lung capacity. But that is the gold standard when doing research like this. Been talking for a little bit. Please remind me the next part
No,
of the
no,
question.
that's great. And I just have a couple of follow-ups. So a crossover design, just for people who are not familiar, it means that you might get treatment A at one point in time and treatment B at another point in time. Did everybody go through everything, or how did that work?
Yeah, so not everybody treated all 4 migraine attacks over the course of the year. And so we have in our article that 19 people decided to not treat any migraine attacks over the course of the year for one reason or another. So we had data actually coming from 73 patients. And of those, 52 patients treated all 4 migraine attacks. 6 of them treated 3 attacks, 6 of them treated 2 attacks, and then 9 of them only treated 1 attack. There's a lot of reasons why that might be. Maybe people found that it was hard with their need to drive within 4 hours. We told everyone that they couldn't drive within 4 hours. Maybe they forgot about the study. Maybe they had migraines when they were at work. And maybe they just wanted to go back to using the medications that they'd been using uh, prior to.
So, but it is, I'm sorry. So it is a very powerful design where the same person goes through several, or at least two different treatments. It may be the active treatment and placebo, or treatment with A and B and C and such, because it's the same person. And that's a better way in a sense than comparing person A to person B, where there could be other sources of variation, right?
Certainly, I've seen studies where they randomize patients and then you look at it at the end and, well, one group's older, the other one's younger. One group's, more men, the other one's more women. And when you have a crossover study, you avoid some of those surprises that one might get after the end of a long and complicated, after a long journey of doing a study that required a lot of work.
The other thing you mentioned is they didn't smoke the marijuana. It was a special vaporizer. Can you say a word of what that is? I assume it wasn't a vape pen or something.
Right, absolutely. And in my clinical practice, I recommend against vape pens, against waxes and oils. Before the pandemic, there was a high profile research paper that came out about vitamin E acetate being found as a contaminant that was making people sick when they were using waxes and oils. People were using here the Stores and Bickle Mighty Vaporizer, which is a research grade vaporizer, and they were vaporizing flour from the United Drug Supply. So it's considered to be among the options a safer route of inhaled cannabis compared to things like vape pens, waxes, oils, or smoking.
Okay, and just tell us then what were the findings? I mean, what are the endpoints that you measured, and what were the findings that you thought were?
So, what we found first looking at pain relief at 2 hours. So, this is people whose migraines were less severe on a 0 to 3 scale. And research studies, they'll say 0, no pain, 1, mild pain, 2, moderate pain, or 3, severe pain. So, people, if their pain had come down from a moderate or severe, a 2 or a 3, down to either no pain or mild, a 0 or 1, that would be pain relief. And we saw that about 2/3 of patients had pain relief with either the THC-CBD mix or the THC alone. And those were both statistically significant and superior to the placebo cannabis. The CBD, meanwhile, was not superior to the placebo cannabis for pain relief at 2 hours. Then you look at a higher bar, which is pain freedom at 2 hours. So here, this is only looking at the percentage of people who had gone from moderate or severe pain down to having no pain at all at 2 hours, migraine pain completely gone. And here, it was only the THC CBD mix that was superior to placebo. 4.5% of people had pain freedom at 2 hours. And the classic teaching is you do not compare across studies, but we see in other studies that used people who actually had less severe migraines that were telling people to treat, that they could treat in the mild stage of a migraine, they could treat even earlier. And they were looking at the same outcome of pain freedom at 2 hours. At even drugs that are blockbusters on the market were not accomplishing anything close to 34.5%. So that's really, I mean, I was very surprised. That is, if clinicians or researchers were given that percent and they didn't know what the treatment was, they would say that's pretty impressive. So that's the pain freedom data. So then we looked at most bothersome symptom freedom at 2 hours. So most bothersome symptom freedom, this is what you do is you ask the patient at the beginning of the migraine, which of the associated symptoms are their most severe symptom, either the light sensitivity or the sound sensitivity or the nausea. And then you ask them again at 2 hours, is that symptom completely gone? Most bothersome symptom, great. And what we found was that with the THC CBD mix, that 60% of patients reported that their most bothersome symptom freedom identified at the beginning of the migraine was completely gone at 2 hours. And that was superior to placebo. However, for the THC alone or the CBD alone, that was not statistically superior to placebo. So those were our primary and key secondary endpoints, and it was impressive findings to me. We then looked at a whole bunch of other outcomes. Some of the interesting ones were the sustained pain freedom and the sustained most bothersome symptom freedom. at 24 and 48 hours. For pain freedom, the THC-CBD mix was superior to placebo at 24 hours. And at 48 hours, it was not quite. It was close to, but not quite statistically significant versus placebo. For the most bothersome symptom freedom at 24 hours and 48 hours, it was statistically significantly superior to placebo, both at 24 hours and at 48 hours. And for the THC alone, the CBD alone, neither of those were superior to placebo at 24 or 48 hours for either the pain freedom or for the most bothersome symptom freedom.
Now, when you talk about the most bothersome symptom, you mentioned that nausea is one of them. Of course, we know that THC itself is an anti-nausea agent. Was there enough information to see which most bothersome symptom was most benefited, shall we say?
Yeah, so this was one of the big surprises of the study for me, was that we saw that the freedom from photophobia and the freedom from phonophobia, so light sensitivity and sound sensitivity, that both of those were statistically significantly less, or sorry, there were higher rates of freedom with the THC CBD mix than with the placebo. And we didn't see that with the THC alone or the CBD alone. And that's very significant. It's also very significant, or it's interesting that the nausea was not different between the THC CBD mix or placebo. And there could be a few reasons. Maybe is that people, there might be more placebo response to placebo cannabis because the public might think about cannabis as being a good treatment for nausea. For sure, it's been used, by many, many people for nausea related to chemotherapeutics and for other reasons. Another possible reason might just be that there are very high rates of nausea, maybe improving over the course of the migraine attack for the patients in this study. Across treatments. But I thought it was so important to look at them independently, and not all studies do, because there was the possibility that it might look like most bothersome symptom freedom was improving, but actually it was only nausea improving, and that maybe cannabis was just an antiemetic, was a thought that I had at the beginning of the study. And we certainly don't find that. And I think that this points to that the cannabis is actually working on the migraine centers of the brain, which there's many areas of the brain involved with migraine, that it's not merely that it acts on the areas of the brain involved with nausea. I think that's pretty clear from our results.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you highlighted that it was the THC CBD mix that had the best effect. Was there any tendency for the THC alone, for example, to do anything? Or I know that's not a question you're supposed to ask. If something isn't significant, it isn't. But did you think there was any signal there at all?
Yeah, so there is some signal in that the THC alone did achieve pain relief at 2 hours. That was superior. And that is important. That was our primary outcome. But it's interesting that the two secondary outcomes that are so important in this study, pain freedom, most bothersome symptom freedom, at 2 hours, if those were negative, the pain relief at 1 hour was significant for the THC alone. So there's always this question. And the reason why I thought it was important to study THC alone is that CBD can compete in some ways with THC at the CB1 receptor in the brain, that maybe the CBD we could have found might have actually decreased some of the effects of the THC.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good. Now, in terms of, there's always side effects, right? In any kind of medication administration, were there any notable side effects that were problematic?
So, first of all, we did not have any serious adverse events in this study. Going into the study, my concern was that I'd be getting pages at night, about people getting paranoid, ending up in the emergency room. We didn't have any of that. The side effects that we saw were the side effects that everybody, I think, knew about ahead of time. There are no new side effects discovered. But whether they were experiencing sleepiness, euphoria, cognitive impairment, and how high they felt on a 0 to 10 scale. In general, there were more side effects, higher rates of these with the T as compared to the THC CBD mix. And it was higher with those than it was with the CBD or with the placebo. And that's not surprising. We know that CBD can decrease the psychoactive side effects that people experience with THC, and we hear this from our patients. At 1 hour, there were higher rates of sleepiness, euphoria, cognitive impairment, and highness than there was at 2 hours. And that also is as expected. The impressive thing was even as these side effects are decreasing and then ultimately gone, that people continue to have when you break the migraines were not coming back very often. And that is an important finding. Also, that the highness was not very high in this study. So it was in the THC CBD mix with these percentages that the highness at 1 hour was on average 2.4 out of 10. And at 2 hours, it was 1.3 out of 10. So what I take up from this, to tell patients is that you don't need to be using cannabis to what doctors might say, titrating it to the highness, that you don't need to use it at dosages that make you high. Uh, Using relatively low amounts, you can get the anti-migraine effects with hopefully not having too much of the highness.
Yeah. And that's interesting because in other work that CMCR has been associated with related to, say, neuropathic pain, a different kind of pain, Dr. Mark Wallace and others found a similar thing that modest dose of THC in that case, it was effective. Very low doses were less effective, but high doses actually were kind of counterproductive. So there is kind of a sweet spot here, if you will. You don't have to be blitzed in order to get the effect. Right.
Right. Very important for, anybody who's listening out there and thinking about trying this.
Yeah. Now, just wrapping up this particular study, roughly kind of what's the age group that these people were in? And in general, were they experienced with use of cannabis or not? Just in general terms.
Right. Our patient population looked a lot like the migraine studies that have been published, where the average age was 40, and it was 80% female. And that's very common across migraine research studies. Great. So we asked people about their prior cannabis use. 36% told us that they had never previously used cannabis. 23% said more than 1 year. 40% said that they had used within the prior year, and 1% did not answer. For frequency of cannabis use, 17% said less than once a year. 11% said less than once a month, 4% said monthly, 11% said weekly, 5% said daily. And everybody had to have a negative cannabis urine drug screen prior to entry into the study. So when they said that they were daily users, we don't know whether when they're daily users, if that might have been years prior, but we know that nobody coming into the study was actually a daily user at that point, or we would have found that on their urine drug screen.
Okay, so generally speaking, these were people in their 40s, largely women, and most of them had at least some passing experience with using cannabis. Is that a fair wrap up?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, that's super interesting. Now that you've done that, do you have thoughts about next steps? What are the next questions?
Yeah, so we are working on launching a NFL-funded study looking at a couple of treatments, including CBD for persistent post-traumatic headache, which of course is of interest to the NFL. And that would be for headache prevention. So rather than trying to use a vaporized product to get to the brain as quickly as possible to break a migraine attack, here people would be using it multiple times a day to prevent headaches from occurring. Also hoping to do some additional further studies looking at vaporized cannabinoids for acute migraine, because there's certainly still unanswered questions in the space, as well as the need for a second study to get into guidelines. I think that this is one of the best uses of cannabinoids, in that it's a condition that you can break very quickly with infrequent use. So unlike other pain conditions where people might need to use cannabinoids twice a day or 3 times a day, here, if you just use it once, when you have the symptoms, that would be an indication that has guidelines, and those guidelines, they generally want to see the results of 2 placebo-controlled RCTs. So with one more, I think that this would be something that will be included in future guidelines. I think that's very important for
An RCT
both the
is a
headache field
randomized
as well as for
control.
cannabis research.
Right. So I suppose another question is you had vaporized use and you explained why that, by inhaling a medication, it quickly gets to the brain and other organs as opposed to hanging around in your gut and visiting the liver and all of that stuff, which can take a lot longer. What do you think about though the practicalities then of cannabinoids as medicines if it has to be vaporized? Is there a chance there could be an oral form, or has that even been looked at? For example, we know that dronabinol or marinol is basically THC, which is actually approved by the FDA for a couple of indications. Has anybody done studies with that?
Most people with migraine, they use oral medications. They use oral triptans and oral CGRPs, and there's a lot of convenience to oral treatments. The of intranasal medicines and injectable medicines do seem to be higher, but patient use seems to be lower. So I think patients are sort of showing us that the practicalities of having something you can put in your pocket or put in your purse and carry with you if you're somebody with migraine, that might be for some people what is the treatment that they actually want to use. So I think that there is the role to develop oral treatments. Do I think that you're going to have as high response rates? I think you're less likely to have as high response rates or as quick response rates with oral formulations. Companies have different ways to help to speed up oral absorption of products. And hopefully some of these, are going to be able to help to have oral options be something that patients can use and use with benefit. But my hunch is that vaporized is still going to be the fastest rate of medicine to the brain, the highest rates of pain freedom, most bothersome symptom freedom at 1 hour and 2 hours that we're going to see.
All right. So, wrapping it up, what would you say is your advice to people with migraines who, have been on traditional treatments and are not getting optimum relief? Would you advise in jurisdictions where it is legal, in states at least where it's legal to recommend it, that people at least discuss that with their physicians? Or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. So certainly, first of all, do have a doctor, do talk to your doctor, especially if you're having a high frequency of migraines. It's important to talk to a doctor about preventive treatments. If you might be overusing acute medications, other medicines that might be causing rebound headaches or medication overuse headache, please talk about that with your doctor. If you haven't tried medicines like triptans and CGRPs, please talk about those with your doctor. But after that, and after your doctors have tried with you standard of care medications, if somebody wants to use these and with discussion with your doctor, do you think that the 2-to-1 ratio using more CBD than THC has the best evidence in our research? And also the side effects are less. I don't think you need to use very much. I don't think you need to get high. If you're getting that, around that 2.4 out of 10 level at 1 hour, that you're probably using enough. And then certainly I do not recommend waxes, oils, or smoking. That if you're going to be using a product for inhalation, using a medical grade vaporizer and vaporizing flower seems to be the safest of the options. And one other thing that I was just thinking about, when we're talking about risks, if you have a history of addiction, certainly please discuss that with your doctor. And of course, cannabinoids should not be used by people who are pregnant or breastfeeding.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schuster. This has been a fascinating journey through migraine and cannabis and its potentialities as another therapeutic agent. Again, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it very much. And good luck with your further work with NFL and migraine.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Grant, for having me.
Thank you again.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media, including Twitter/X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms, or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.